In the summer of 1863, the sheriff of Bannack, Montana, collected $2.50 from every man in town to build a gallows. He went door to door personally. Nobody refused. Henry Plummer was the most respected man in the camp. Handsome, well-spoken, a crack shot. The kind of lawman who patrolled Main Street at dawn in an elegant overcoat while the saloons were still dark. He designed the gallows himself, and he built a jail to go with them, the first jail in what would become Montana. 7 months later, on a night so cold the bodies would freeze solid before sunrise, 75 men marched Plummer up Hangman's Gulch and hanged him from his own crossbeam. His last words, according to the men who killed him, "Give me a high drop, boys." That was January 10th, 1864. Bannack was barely 18 months old. And nobody, not historians, not the state of Montana, not the jury at Plummer's posthumous trial 129 years later, has ever been able to say for certain whether the right man swung. This is the story of the town those gallows built. Gold has been trickling through Montana creek beds since the 1850s, but nobody much cared. The quantities were small. The territory was impossibly remote. A blank stretch of the map that belonged, on paper, to Idaho Territory, which itself barely existed. The real action was in California, in Colorado, at Pikes Peak. Montana was afterthought country, a place you passed through on your way to somewhere that mattered. That changed on July 28, 1862, when a group of Colorado prospectors, led by a man named John White, stopped along a creek in the Beaverhead Valley, about 80 miles south of where Butte would someday stand, and found gold in the gravel. The creek had been called Willard's Creek by Lewis and Clark when they passed through in 1805, but by the time White got there, the grasshoppers were so thick on the banks that people had taken to calling it Grasshopper Creek, and the name stuck. White's party filed claims that afternoon. Within weeks, the news was moving south and east along the trails. And here is the detail that made Bannack different from a dozen other strikes that summer. Grasshopper Creek's gold was nearly pure. 99%, some assays said. 99.5%. Most placer gold ran about 95%. The difference may sound academic, but to a man standing in a creek with a pan in his hands, it was the difference between gold that had to be refined and gold you could spend as money the moment you picked it up. Word of that purity traveled fast. By the time winter shut down the diggings, an estimated $700,000 in gold had been pulled from Grasshopper Creek, and there were only about 400 people living there. Think about that number for a moment. $700,000, divided among 400 miners, in 1862 money, in a place with no bank, no telegraph, no law, and no road worthy of the name. That is the kind of math that builds a town overnight and destroys it just as fast. By spring of 1863, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people had poured into the gulch. Bannack, named for the local Bannack Indians, misspelled when the post office application reached Washington, went from a scattering of tents and dugouts to a functional town in a matter of weeks. 3 hotels, 3 bakeries, 3 blacksmith shops, 2 stables, 2 meat markets, a grocery store, a restaurant, a brewery, a billiard hall, and 4 saloons. Most of the early arrivals lived in whatever they could throw together: tents, dugouts carved into the hillside, shanties of rough-cut timber, even wagons left where they stopped. Up on the slope above Main Street, a row of one-room shacks housed unmarried miners in quarters the size of modern utility closets. People called it Bachelor's Row, and the diaries that survive from the period make clear that where you slept didn't matter much. You were here for the creek, not the accommodations. The population was overwhelmingly male. The few women were either miners' wives or, more commonly, saloon girls and what the newspapers of the era called painted ladies. Dances were the primary social event, the only occasions when the wives of the camp could feel something like civilization. The crowd that flooded in was not exclusively composed of honest prospectors. Civil War deserters from both sides, river pirates, professional gamblers, and outright criminals had all drifted west, drawn by the same purity numbers and the same absence of law. In September 1862, a freight wagon coming from Utah and bound for the Deer Lodge Valley detoured to Bannack when the freighters realized they could sell their goods right there. That wagon probably kept a number of miners alive through the first Montana winter, which none of them had planned for. Granville Stewart, the man historians would later call the father of Montana, showed up that November, not to mine, but to sell beef. His brother James opened a store. There was money to be made on every side of the gold, and the people arriving in Bannack understood that perfectly. The Stewarts lasted less than a year before moving on, but in a gold camp, less than a year is a career. Bannack sat at 5,800 feet, tucked into a limestone canyon where Grasshopper Creek had carved a passage between two granite intrusions. It was beautiful country and brutal country. The nearest settlement of any size was Salt Lake City, roughly 400 miles to the south. The nearest functioning court was even farther. There was no territorial government, no federal marshal within reach, and the Civil War had made Washington utterly uninterested in policing the far side of the Continental Divide. Bannack, in 1863, was one of the most lawless places in the United States, not because its citizens were especially wicked, but because there was literally no mechanism for making them behave. Into this vacuum walked Henry Plummer. Plummer was about 30 years old when he arrived in Bannack in late 1862. He was originally from Addison, Maine, the youngest of 7 children in a family of sea captains. He was slight, consumptive, and entirely unsuited for the seafaring life his father and brothers had led. When his father died and the family's finances collapsed, young Henry did what half of New England seemed to be doing in the early 1850s. He went west. He arrived in California in 1852, worked a mine, bought a bakery, and at the age of 24 got himself elected Marshal of Nevada City, California, at the time the 3rd largest settlement in the state. He was, by all accounts, extremely good at the job. He was also, by some accounts, a killer. In 1857, he shot the husband of a woman he was involved with. He went to prison, got out, and the next several years become a tangle of gunfights, escapes, bribed jailers, and westward flight that researchers have been trying to untangle for a century and a half. By the time he reached Montana, Plummer either was or was not a murderer, depending on which historian you ask. What nobody disputes is that he was charismatic, capable, and possessed of what even his enemies called wonderful executive ability. In January 1863, in the saloon of the Goodrich Hotel, Plummer killed a man named Jack Cleveland. Cleveland had been needling him for weeks. They'd been rivals for the affections of a woman named Electa Bryan. And when Cleveland went for his gun, Plummer was faster. A miner's jury acquitted him on the spot. Self-defense, they said, the code of the camp. 4 months later, in May 1863, the same miners elected Plummer sheriff of Bannack and all surrounding camps. He won by a landslide. He immediately appointed 2 deputies, Buck Stinson and Ned Ray. He built the jail. He collected the money for the gallows. He even applied to be a deputy U.S. Marshal, and his application was approved, though the letter confirming it arrived with the kind of timing that makes you wonder whether history has a sense of humor, shortly after his death. In June 1863, Plummer married Electa Bryan at the Sun River Mission Station. They settled into a log home in Bannack. She left less than 3 months later, returning to her parents in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She would never see him again. Here is where the story fractures, and where it has stayed fractured ever since. The traditional version, the one taught in Montana schools for 100 years, the one first published by a man named Thomas Dimsdale in what became the first book ever printed in Montana Territory, goes like this. Sheriff Plummer was not just a lawman. He was the secret leader of a gang of road agents who called themselves the Innocents. They numbered over 100 men. They used coded neckties and secret signals. They operated out of ranches and saloons along the road between Bannack and Virginia City, 80 miles to the east, where an even bigger gold strike had hit in May 1863. They robbed stagecoaches and pack trains. They murdered anyone who could identify them. Plummer, using his position as sheriff, fed the gang information about which coaches were carrying gold and when. The road between the two camps ran red. By some contemporary accounts, later disputed, as many as 100 travelers were murdered in the fall of 1863 alone. That road deserves a moment's attention because it explains why Bannack was the kind of place where a sheriff could allegedly run a criminal enterprise in plain sight. The distance between Bannack and Virginia City was roughly 80 miles of mountain trail. No proper road, no relay stations, no military posts. Every ounce of gold that left Bannack for the east passed over that trail. So did every merchant returning with cash. In October 1863, gang members reportedly held up the Peabody and Caldwell stagecoach. In November, a 13-year-old boy named Henry Tilden, the ward of Sidney Edgerton, was stopped at gunpoint by 3 masked horsemen and searched. Tilden later claimed he recognized Plummer by his overcoat and his pistol. When Plummer heard about the accusation, he questioned the boy directly. Tilden, frightened, went silent. But the suspicion had landed, and it landed on the doorstep of Plummer's most powerful political rivals. Meanwhile, another of the gang's known gathering spots was Cyrus Skinner's saloon on Main Street in Bannack. Skinner was one of the men Plummer had known from his Idaho days, and his establishment was, if the traditional account is believed, the nerve center of the operation. The saloon still stands in Bannack today, quiet as a confessional. The revisionist version, assembled by later historians working from court records, diaries, and newspaper accounts that Dimsdale either didn't have or chose to ignore, tells a different story. In this version, there were perhaps a dozen killings in the mining camps that year. Terrible, but far short of the legendary 100. There is no solid evidence that an organized gang existed, and no evidence beyond the coerced confessions of men about to be hanged that Plummer led one. The real crime wave, these historians argue, was the vigilantes themselves, and the men who organized the vigilantes, Wilbur Fisk Sanders, the territory's most ambitious lawyer, and Sidney Edgerton, who would become Montana's first territorial governor, were Republicans who saw the charismatic, popular, Democratic sheriff as a political obstacle. They didn't hang Plummer because he was a criminal. They hanged him because he was in the way. The truth, as is almost always the case with events that happened in remote places 160 years ago, is probably somewhere in the middle, possibly unknowable, and certainly more interesting than either clean version. What is not in dispute is what happened on the ground. In late 1863, with robberies increasing and suspicion thickening, men from Bannack, Virginia City, and the nearby camp of Nevada City began meeting in secret. They called themselves the Vigilance Committee. They adopted a symbol, the numbers 3777, chalked on doors and tacked to tent flaps, and anyone who found that symbol knew he had a choice: leave the territory or die. The meaning of those numbers has never been conclusively established. Some say it referred to the dimensions of a grave, 3 feet wide, 7 feet long, 77 inches deep. Others have proposed different theories. The Montana Highway Patrol, which still wears 3777 on its shoulder patches, officially claims not to know. In December 1863, the vigilantes caught and tried a road agent named George Ives for the murder of a young prospector. Wilbur Sanders prosecuted. Ives was convicted and hanged on the spot, in the street, in Nevada City. This was the crack in the dam. Over the next 6 weeks, the vigilantes moved through the camps with extraordinary speed and no particular interest in due process. The pivotal confession came from a man named Erastus Red Yeager, who was already standing with a rope around his neck when he named Henry Plummer as the leader of the innocents. Whether Yeager was telling the truth, or whether he was telling the vigilantes what he thought might save his life, which it did not, is the question that has haunted Montana history ever since. On the evening of January 10, 1864, Francis Thompson, a boarder at the home of Plummer's in-laws, the Vales, heard the creak of the small footbridge that crossed Grasshopper Creek. It was the sound of boots, many boots, moving together. Thompson knew what was coming. He had been privy to Sanders and Edgerton's plans to eliminate Plummer. He said nothing. Somewhere between 50 and 75 men crossed that bridge and split into three groups. One went for Ned Ray. One went for Buck Stinson. The third knocked at the Vale's door. Martha Vale opened it. Plummer was inside, unarmed, sick. His tuberculosis had flared, and he'd been lying on the Vale's couch for several days. The men asked him to step outside to discuss a matter regarding another prisoner. He agreed. Martha went back inside where Thompson kept her company. Plummer walked out into the January night, and within minutes he understood that no one was interested in discussing prisoners. They marched all three men, Ray, Stinson, and Plummer, up the gulch to the gallows that Plummer himself had designed, that Plummer himself had paid for, that Plummer himself had built to bring order to this lawless place. Ray went first, cursing and fighting. Stinson went next. Plummer, according to every account, was calm. He offered to tell the vigilantes where $100,000 in stolen gold was buried if they would let him live. They declined. He asked to see his wife. She was 1,000 miles away. He asked for a good drop, a long fall, so his neck would break and death would come quickly. The vigilantes obliged. The three bodies were left hanging overnight in temperatures well below zero, freezing solid in the dark. They were buried the next day in shallow graves beside the gallows. What happened to Plummer's body afterward belongs less to history than to macabre folklore. The town doctor, a man named Glick, reportedly dug him up sometime later, curious about a shotgun slug that had lodged in Plummer's right elbow months earlier. He amputated the arm and found the slug in the wrist, worn smooth and polished by the bones turning upon it. Decades later, according to local legend, two men on a dare dug up the grave again, cut off the skull, and brought it back to the Bank Exchange Saloon, where it sat behind the bar for several years, until the saloon burned down in 1898 and took the skull with it. Within 6 weeks of Plummer's hanging, the vigilantes had executed at least 21 men across the territory. In some accounts, the number is 24. 4 days after Plummer died, in Virginia City, 5 more men, Frank Parrish, Boone Helm, Jack Gallagher, Hayes Lyons, and a man known as Clubfoot George Lane, were hanged simultaneously from a support beam inside an unfinished building on Main Street. The building had no roof yet. The open crossbeam was simply convenient. The bodies dangled between the timbers in what one later account called a grotesque window display. They were buried on Boot Hill, so named because the men died with their boots on. When a Virginia City mayor and his friends went looking for the graves decades later, armed with shovels and a bottle of whiskey, they identified Clubfoot George by his deformed foot. The robberies slowed, or they didn't, depending on whose account you read. Later sources noted that after the Plummer hangings, stagecoach robberies actually showed more evidence of organized criminal activity, more perpetrators, and better intelligence about cargo. The revisionist historians use this fact as their sharpest weapon. If the mastermind was dead, why did the operation improve? And the vigilantes did not confine their activities to proven criminals. A preacher's son named Bill Hunter, who had publicly called the vigilante leaders stranglers, was found 3 weeks later hanging from a cottonwood tree, frozen stiff. 3 years later, Territorial Governor Thomas Maher began speaking publicly against the vigilantes. The miners themselves issued a warning. If the vigilantes hanged one more man, the citizens would retaliate 5 for 1. The era of the rope was over. But its mythology was just beginning. Thomas Dimsdale, an English schoolteacher who had arrived in Virginia City and become editor of the Montana Post, the territory's first newspaper, published his account of the Vigilantes as a series of articles in 1865. In 1866, those articles were collected into a book, The Vigilantes of Montana. It was the first book ever published in what would become the state of Montana, and it told the story entirely from the Vigilantes' perspective. Dimsdale was, by most accounts, a member of the Vigilance Committee himself. His book presented Plummer as a very demon, and the Vigilantes as the saviors of civilization. For a century, that was the accepted version. It's the version that put 3777 on the highway patrol patches. It's the version that gave Montana its founding mythology, a territory born not from legislation, but from the gallows. Bannack, meanwhile, was already losing the race, and it had been losing it since the previous spring. In May 1863, just weeks before Plummer was elected sheriff, a group of prospectors had discovered gold at Alder Gulch, about 80 miles to the east. They rode into Bannack to buy supplies, and when they paid in fresh gold dust, word leaked instantly. Miners abandoned their Grasshopper Creek claims and stampeded east. The settlement that sprang up at Alder Gulch became Virginia City, and its placers turned out to be the richest in Montana. So rich that in the first 3 years, an estimated $30 million in gold was pulled from the gulch. Bannack's $700,000 had been extraordinary. Virginia City's $30 million made it look like pocket change. On May 26, 1864, Sidney Edgerton, who had lobbied Lincoln personally, carrying gold nuggets to Washington to demonstrate the territory's wealth and to remind the Union that it needed Western gold to finance the war, succeeded in getting Montana recognized as a separate territory. He was appointed governor. He commissioned a census that counted nearly 16,000 residents in the territory, with about 11,500 of them in the Virginia City and Alder Gulch area. Bannack was named the first territorial capital, and the legislature met for the first time in Edgerton's own cabin that December. But the honor was practically meaningless. The real population center was already at Virginia City. In 1865, less than a year after Bannack became the capital, the designation moved to Virginia City. A few years after that, it moved again to Helena, following gold strikes at Last Chance Gulch. By the 1880s, Helena had more millionaires per capita than any city in the country, 50 of them. Bannack had been the capital of Montana for roughly one legislative session. The gold played out with the same speed it had arrived. The richest placer ground, the easy gold, the kind you could pick up with a pan and a strong back, was substantially worked out by the mid-1860s. Population drained away toward Virginia City, toward Helena, toward the next rumor. For a couple of years in the late 1860s, Grasshopper Creek and Bannack were nearly deserted. But the town didn't die. It contracted, hardened, and found reasons to keep going. Hard rock mining, quartz mining, which required stamp mills and capital and patience, picked up where the placer miners had left off. Bannack's first quartz claims had actually been staked as early as 1862, making them among the first in the territory. A crude, hand-made, water-powered stamp mill crushed ore from the Dakota lode. Steam-powered mills followed. The population stabilized at a few hundred, and Bannack settled into something it had never been during the rush, a functioning small town. In 1874, the Masonic Lodge built a 2-story white frame building on Main Street. Lodge upstairs, schoolhouse downstairs. It still stands. In 1875, a 2-story brick courthouse went up, designed in the Italianate style, the most substantial building Bannack had ever seen. It was meant to declare permanence. Bannack was the Beaver Head County seat, and the courthouse was proof that this was not a camp anymore, it was a community. The building had a grand staircase. It had safes. It had the weight and solidity of brick in a town that had known only log and frame. In August 1877, that courthouse became a fortress. Word reached Bannack that Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce, fresh from a bloody engagement with the U.S. Army at the Battle of the Big Hole just 50 miles away, were headed straight for the town. Women and children were rushed into the courthouse. The rumor, it may be apocryphal, but it has persisted, was that the children were prepared to hide inside the building's large iron safes if the attack came. It never came. The Nez Perce passed through the area, rested for 2 days, and moved on, pursued by soldiers. They were fighting a running retreat of over 1,000 miles, and Bannack was not their concern. A traveling Methodist preacher named William Van Orsdell, everyone called him Brother Van, happened to be in Bannack during the scare. When the danger passed, he seized the moment. All these people gathered together in relief and gratitude. It was the perfect time to talk them into building a church. They did. The Methodist Church, completed in 1877, was the first and only building in Bannack constructed solely as a house of worship. It was built in essence as a thank you note to God for an attack that never happened. 4 years later, Bannack lost the county seat. Dillon, 18 miles to the east, had the railroad. Bannack had a dirt road. In 1881, after a contentious election, the county government moved to Dillon, and the brick courthouse, that declaration of permanence, stood empty. It stood empty for nearly a decade. In 1890, a man named Dr. John Singleton Meade bought the building for $1,250 and turned it into a hotel. He added a front porch with a balcony, furnished the dining room with white linen tablecloths and fine china, and reopened the building as the Hotel Meade. In a town that had lost its gold, its capital status, and its county seat, a man spent $1,250 on a building and put linen on the tables. The Hotel Meade became the social center of Bannack, the place where travelers stopped and miners celebrated, and the town pretended for an evening that the best days weren't behind it. During the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, the hotel was pressed into service as a makeshift hospital. The building that had been a courthouse, then a fortress, then a hotel, now a place where people came to die or recover. It would open and close sporadically over the next several decades, tracking the fortunes of the mines with the precision of a barometer, until it closed for the last time in the 1940s. Those fortunes had one more surge left. In the spring of 1895, the first successful bucket lift gold dredge in the United States began operating on Grasshopper Creek at Bannack. It was called the Fielding L. Graves, named for the local entrepreneur who built it. The machine was electric-powered, fed by a generator on the creek bank, and it could process 2,000 yards of gravel per day. It cost $35,000 to build. The dredge sat on a barge and used a long chain of steel buckets mounted on a conveyor belt to scoop the creek bed down to bedrock. The gravel was flushed through sluices, the gold captured, the waste dumped. As it worked, the barge floated on a small lake of its own making, inching forward yard by yard. In its best weeks, working the richest ground, the Graves dredge produced cleanups of $22,000 and $38,000 in successive weeks, staggering returns on a single piece of equipment. A second dredge arrived that fall. 2 more came in 1896. By the turn of the century, 5 dredges were working Grasshopper Creek. The dredges brought people back and money back, but they also brought something else: destruction. A gold dredge does not mine politely. It scoops the entire creek bed down to bedrock, flushes the gravel through sluices, and dumps the waste in enormous piles. It floats on its own small lake, inching forward, leaving behind a moonscape of rock tailings and stagnant ponds. The dredges at Bannack destroyed several hundred of the buildings that had been erected during the 1860s rush. The town's own revival ate its own history. The ponds the machines left behind are still visible on Bannack's south side today, surrounded by heaps of discarded rock that nobody ever bothered to reclaim. By 1902, the dredges had worked through the remaining placer deposits, and the last of them shut down. Lode mining continued sporadically. A 10-stamp mill went up in 1920, operated for about a year, was reopened and electrified in 1933, and ran until the early 1940s, when it ceased permanently at the onset of World War II. That electrification, incidentally, brought electric power to Bannack itself for the first time in 1930. The town got electric lights 68 years after it was founded, and barely a decade before it died. The post office closed in 1938. The school ran out of students and closed in the early 1950s. By 1953, Bannack had a single resident, C.W. Stallings, who had acquired the town site and its remaining buildings from a bankrupt mining company. He was, in effect, the owner of an entire ghost town. Not long after, Stallings sold his holdings, every building, every lot, every board and brick and nail in what had once been the capital of Montana Territory, for $1,000. The buyers were a group of citizens' organizations interested in preservation. The state of Montana took over management and established Bannack State Park in the 1950s. In 1961, Bannack was declared a National Historic Landmark. Over its lifetime, the Bannack Mining District produced an estimated $12 million in gold at the historic price of roughly $20.67 per ounce. That's approximately 240,000 ounces. At contemporary gold prices, the district's output would be worth something north of $500 million. All of it came from a creek in a canyon that you can walk the length of in an afternoon. A local historian named Mabel Ovitt moved to Bannack, published a history of the town in 1952, and spent the rest of her life campaigning for its preservation. She is buried in Bannack Cemetery, the last recorded burial there. A few residents held on into the early 1970s, and then they too were gone. Today, 60-odd structures line the old main street of Bannack, maintained by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, in a state that preservation specialists call arrested decay. The buildings are not restored. They are not polished or repainted or made to look the way they did in 1863 or 1875 or 1895. They are stabilized, kept from collapsing, but otherwise left exactly as time has shaped them. The wallpaper in the Hotel Meade peels from the walls in long, curling strips. The original carpet in the Masonic Lodge is threadbare under your feet. The floorboards in the schoolhouse are the same boards that children walked on in the 1880s. Skinner's Saloon still stands. Cyrus Skinner was one of Plummer's associates, and his saloon was, by reputation, the planning room for road agent operations. Today, it is 4 walls and a silence. The Methodist Church still stands. The jail that Plummer built, Montana's first, still stands, low and dark, its log walls so thick that the temperature drops the moment you step through the door. You can still see the iron bars. And on a low rise above Grasshopper Creek, at the edge of what used to be Hangman's Gulch, a set of gallows stands. They are a replica. The original timbers rotted away long ago, but the spot is the same spot. The ground is the same ground. In 2013, a flash flood swept through Bannack and damaged roughly 50 of the park's 60 historic buildings. The town survived that, too, the way it survived everything. Not through strength or luck, but through the simple stubbornness of wood and brick that has nowhere left to go. On May 7, 1993, 129 years after Henry Plummer was hanged without trial, a posthumous trial was staged in the courthouse at Virginia City. It was organized by the Twin Bridges Public School District as a living history class. Students were assigned the roles of historical figures and researched their characters. A real judge presided. 12 locally registered voters sat as jurors. Witnesses took the stand. The prosecution and defense presented their evidence, such as it was, drawn from 130 years of conflicting accounts, self-serving memoirs, coerced confessions, and partisan histories. The jury deliberated and came back split, 6 for guilty, 6 for not guilty. A hung jury, and yes, everyone involved noted the word. Had Plummer been alive, he would have walked free. His wife Electa, who had fled Bannack in September 1863 and never returned, learned of his death by letter. She maintained for the rest of her life that he was innocent. She eventually moved to South Dakota, married a widower named James Maxwell, raised 2 sons, and died in 1912 at the age of 72. She is buried in Wauconda, South Dakota, about as far from Grasshopper Creek as a person can get without leaving the Great Plains. The question of who Henry Plummer really was has become, in a sense, the question of who Montana really is. Frederick Allen, whose 2004 book, A Decent, Orderly Lynching, remains the most balanced account of the affair, observed that the revisionist historians who insist Plummer was an innocent victim of political assassination paint a picture as one-sided as Dimsdale's, but with Plummer as the white hat and his prosecutors as venal bullies. The truth, Allen suggests, resists clean categories. Plummer was probably not the criminal mastermind of legend. The Vigilantes were probably not the selfless guardians of order that Dimsdale made them out to be. What actually happened in Bannack in the winter of 1863 to 64 was messier, more human, and more troubling than any version that fits on a historical marker. There is one more thing worth knowing. The numbers 3777, the Vigilante Code, the warning scrawled on doors, the symbol of frontier justice, appear nowhere in any document from the 1860s. The earliest verifiable reference dates to a newspaper mention years later. Nobody wrote them down at the time, nobody explained them, and the oath of secrecy sworn by the roughly 100 members of the Vigilance Committee ensured that whatever the numbers originally meant died with the men who used them. And yet those three numbers are on the shoulder patch of every Montana Highway Patrol officer working the roads today. The state police of Montana identify themselves in the 21st century with a symbol invented by men who hanged a sheriff without a trial in a town that no longer exists. Bannack sits 25 miles west of Dillon on a gravel road that winds through sagebrush hills and open rangeland before dropping into the Creek Valley. The elevation is 5,800 feet. The nearest commercial airport is in Butte, over 100 miles away. The park is open year-round, though the visitor center closes after Labor Day. In winter, the old dredge pond freezes over, and on some weekends you can rent ice skates and glide across the water that the machines left behind. The Hotel Meade, courthouse, hotel, refuge from an attack that never came, social hall for a town that was always either booming or dying, still faces Main Street with its front porch and its second-story balcony. Its spiral staircase, the most photographed feature in any Montana ghost town, is intact. The dining room, where the tables were set with fine china, is empty. The rooms upstairs, where the original wallpaper clings to the walls in strips, look out over the same view of Grasshopper Creek that someone would have seen in 1895, when the dredges were running and the Hotel Meade was serving dinner on white linen, and it was still possible to believe that Bannack might come back one more time. The gallows stand on the rise above the creek. The wood is new. The rope is for show. A sign on the interpretive marker tells you what happened here, and the wind comes down the canyon the way it did on the night of January 10th, 1864, when Henry Plummer walked up the hill to the structure he had built with money he had collected from the people who were about to kill him. The replica looks sturdy enough to last, but then the original was built to last, too.